I'm Julia Noyes, your instructor for the watercolor class, and today we are doing still life. So this is lesson number 5. And don't forget, that's my text number, Julia Noyes. So let's get started. As always, you are going to do your thumbnail. That's that little mini drawing. You know how to do that, so get your ideas going on a thumbnail. And make sure at the bottom of your page you write about an artist. Pick an artist off the internet, someone you like, and name, date, birth date, what they did. Have a little picture or sketch. You could do a little photo, copy off a little photo of their work. Tell me what you would do differently, so you get additional points for that. You will do that with every lesson. So this is still life. And of course, still life, you have to do these techniques, as you know. Here's our little technique sheet. So these are the things I'm going to demonstrate to you today. So you will be graded by these techniques, finishing on time, also including the artist's information. The first question you might have is, what's a still life? I mean, it's like life that doesn't run around? Well, kind of. So this is a beginning of a still life. So you can see it's going to be flowers in a container. And of course, for this assignment, you can do techniques we've done before, but we want to make sure you include the 5 new techniques that we're doing today. So here I've started doing some collage. Here's some wet into wet. This is definitely wet into wet. Here I'm doing some gradations, some splattering. So I'm going to combine techniques with this, the 5 things we're learning today, but with other techniques. Here's an example of a still life. We often think of a still life as bottles and jars, containers, fruit. It can be flowers. So we think of this very differently as it's not a portrait, you know, it's not someone's face, it's not a landscape, so it's not trees, but it's objects that we find that we like. One thing I like about this is these are overlapping. You know, this is a really good design technique, is to have overlapping because it ties your objects together. Another technique is to have these objects go off the edges. So this goes off this edge, this goes off this edge, this starts to go off this edge. So it helps to fill up the page. It forces you to think about the whole page, not just one little thing. And you actually get credit for doing that. That's on the critique sheet for grading. So think about that. I will show you, this is a technique we're going to be doing today, is salt. So all this little texture, that is created by the salt that we're going to be using today. You may think, okay, I want to do flowers. That's great. But put them in some kind of container so it looks like a still life. This also has the salt technique we're going to be talking about in a minute. And some of this is done with a twig. Some of it is done with a script liner brush. So the first thing you might do, you might even do some little drawings and do some cutout shapes. So the one thing about still life is if you do it on some paper like this to start with, you can fold it in half and make sure that this duplicates this. It's a lot easier folding it in half. You know, we learned that maybe in elementary school to do that with snowflakes. So this side's always going to match. But sometimes when we draw just freehand, this side does not match that, and suddenly it looks kind of wonky and lopsided. So if you're going to do something, I think it's really worth doing this technique so you're happy with the shape from both sides. And also a common mistake is students often will not get this round down here. It cannot be straight across. If this is a cylinder, this has to be round, the bottom edge has to be round, and the top edge has to be round. So when in doubt, make it even more round so it'll feel like it has volume. And then when you have pieces cut out, if you want to do it with that approach, you can actually lay the pieces down and see if you like the design before you commit to several hours on a project. So I like that this is going off this edge, this is going off this edge, this shape is going off this edge. I'm starting to think about dark shapes, light shapes. So this will show you a painting just maybe a third of the way through. Some of you are buying more watercolor paper, which is great. It comes in often these little pads, like your one that you bought for school, and it has this glue around the edge. So it's fine and great if you take this outside because it's not going to blow around and the pieces aren't going to flutter in the wind. But then when you're ready to take it off, it's simply a matter of taking that glue off, start an edge, and it's simply glued. So then you can take your piece and separate it from the pad of watercolor paper. I actually love to buy them in pads that have the glue. There's always one little edge that doesn't have some glue right here, and you can either stick your fingernail or a brush or something to get it started. Okay? So for your palette, depending on your personality, if you like to start with a very clean palette, that's great. Go ahead and get your paints out and put a little water to them. You might use a mister. Or if you don't want to waste any paint and you just have your paints already on your palette, you can go ahead and add water. That will rejuvenate these because we know watercolors are water soluble. And this makes it ready for us to paint. We don't have to wait. So we can do this right away and just pour a little bit of water on. And in a few minutes, the watercolor will be nice and liquidy and ready to use. Our first technique is using soft and hard edges with your brush. And this is actually quite easy to do because a hard edge, you just leave the brush, put it on, put the brush stroke on, and you don't have to do anything to it. It creates a hard edge over here, hard edge here, hard edge here. So we use hard edge strokes when we want things to be crisp, defined, we want them to come forward in space, we want them to be more detailed. But when we want a soft edge, like here, I'm adding water to this. So I like to mix up some of my watercolor ahead. You can do that in a little jar. And that way I'm not wasting any paint. I can just keep adding water. The only thing is you might not know how much paint is in this. Now this is fairly diluted because there's a lot of water in it, so I can see. But if I'm creating a sharp edge, I just do that. See how it's sharp all the way around? I'm not doing anything else with it. So it's going to create a very definite shape. It's very defined. But other times, when I don't want that to be defined, I'm going to put a stroke down. But while it's still wet, I can add more water to that and diffuse the edge. Can't wait very long. I almost waited too long trying to find my water. So I can still see that shape underneath. So I'm going to do it a little again. I'm going to start with my paint here, but right away I'm going to have this water here to diffuse the edge. See, I couldn't wait very long. With watercolor, you have to act fast. So here I've added the water right away, so I no longer get this straight edge down here. So I'm creating hard edges and very soft edges. Now the example I did here, I added lots of water really fast. So you have to have your water ready to do it. You can't really hesitate. So that's a technique number one, soft and hard edges. And you probably have already done that or figured out how to soften an edge. It's a really typical, common watercolor technique that you will use a lot. Our next technique is using salt. And this is one of my favorites, and you will love this. It's using ordinary table salt, just like this. I've put a little bit out in a lid, so I'm not going to shake it out of the jar and get so much salt all over that I can't control the paint. This only works when you first have the watercolor wet. Once it's dried, the salt is not going to react. So I want to show you some different effects you can get. So here I put down green paint, and right away I put in the salt. Here is also one, but this has a lot of water in it, so the salt effect starts to dissolve. Here the paint is really wet, the salt doesn't even show up. Too much water, not enough salt. Here I can show the salt crystals a little more, but maybe that's not the effect I want. So this is a technique that you have to experiment with and solve. I love this look because maybe this could go on a crock pot, or I don't know, I love this texture, maybe it looks like rocks. So I used quite a bit of paint so it was going to show, and it wasn't super watery, it's not running, but while it's still wet, I'm dropping in the salt crystals. Now when you do that, you don't want to pick up your paper or move it around, because that will make the salt dissolve and it won't create this texture. You can glaze and use this, you know, where you have one color underneath and you let it dry, and then you put another color over it and you create salt effect on top. It doesn't show up very much on this. So you really have to experiment. Sometimes you want a soft effect, so this is using a lot of water, because you can see the crystal shapes are not defined. Here, doesn't this look like snow? So this, not runny, because I'm able to capture these salt crystals. You might ask, okay, can I use big chunks of salt? Yes, like rock salt, you'll get bigger crystal shapes. This is just regular, ordinary table salt. Here, you can guess, the water was runny because it starts to run. I might use this in the back of a landscape. You know, maybe I want kind of a runny background. Maybe it looks a little snowy or foggy, or maybe I just want to create some different textures. So you can use the salt in many ways. You can use the salt for different colors or for different feels. Like this has peach and brown and kind of a whitish color. So I'm dipping into several colors. Here the blue is lighter, more watered down blue, but still it's not runny because I can still see those crystal effects. Here I'm using it on the whole background. I taped these trees off, did my whole background with quite a bit of salt, quite a bit of pigment, and not runny. So the more you do the salt effect, the more you will start to see where you can control it. So here, I want it soft. I don't want the crystals to show. Here, not as much water. I want the crystals to show. Now, if I want them to run, I can pick up my paper while it's still wet, and that's going to make the crystals dissolve and run. So see the different effects you can get? It all depends on how much water is in your paint. So runnier water, less effect. So for this, I'm going to see, this paint has quite a bit of pigment in it. Ooh, lots of pigment, maybe too much. So you can test it. You can test it and say, oh, well, that's quite a bit of pigment there and not much water in that. Is that going to show? Well, you can almost tell within the first couple minutes if the crystals are going to take effect. If there's not enough water, the salt isn't going to react. So I may want to add a little more water to this. So you can see now it's watery. It's not running, it's not dripping. And so what I'm going to do, I'm salting this like you might salt eggs. Not too much, I don't want it to be just great big clumps, but do you see the difference of how this reacted compared to this? I mean, this doesn't show. Here, you can see the salt crystals and how it is attracting the paint particles. And then as the crystal of the salt, the crystal shapes of the salt dries, it will capture that look. So now I want to do some with even more water. Still quite a bit of pigment. Well, I still want more water. I want this even runnier. So it's quite runny. You can see that it's puddling up. And we'll see. Ooh, I'm sprinkling a lot of salt on there because it's starting to dissolve. So what we're going to do, we're going to come back to this later and see what the crystal effects look like. So I'm not going to pick this up. I'm just going to let it sit. So this was technique number 2, called salt, or using salt. Okay, this is our next technique, which is called stamping. I'm sure you've all stamped before. You know, you can go to the store and buy stamps. You can make your own stamps. Stamps are great for repeating shapes. So here you can do letters, you can do shapes, you can find materials that could be used for stamping. So for example, this is that plastic you can buy. It's a very soft, pliable plastic. It's really easy to cut into. It's great for making stamps. Now stamping is something we do when we want to repeat a shape. So if I like this shape, I might want to cut it into a stamp so I can use it over and over. So I'm simply using my watercolor on top of it, and while it's still wet, gotta do it really fast, I'm going to put this down. I'm touching it and seeing what kind of print I'm able to make from that stamping. Okay, so then I'm going to take it off. Voila! It's just like my stamp here, of course in reverse. So in case you do letters or you do a word where you want to stamp it, you have to think in reverse. So you use the other side of the stamp. I love to make these. They're so much fun, and you can use them over and over and do some beautiful designs. This is a set of stamps. These are numbers and letters. So of course, once you'll want to make sure you wipe these off when you're done so the paint doesn't stick and create a problem for the next time you use it. But you can use all kinds of things that you find for stamps. I mean, you'll start to recycle things, and things you see that are plastic, like this foam plastic. It's a great stamp if I wanted to create this pattern in a stamping effect. So this is just like when you buy a stamping pad. It's the same idea. So, you know, when you're taking a stamp, except instead of using a stamp pad, we're using watercolor. Okay? So for this technique, you're going to want to create your own stamp or find a stamp that you like, some kind of texture, pattern. You know, you could even use a paper punch and stamp out some circles out of some plastic paper. Here's a larger stamp. I made a larger design like this, so I could do some bigger, bolder patterns. You can create your own name. This is my last name, Noyes. I think that would be fun to have in a painting. So you might think, okay, what does that have to do with still life? Well, you can still have words in a still life. You could have the background pattern words, or words that become oblivious, that you can't really see the words. You could do shapes that you want to use just purely for shapes, so that you can repeat different shapes and they become a pattern. They're not really making up a word per se, just to create a lovely pattern. So this is called stamping. It's quite easy. You might think about, when you're doing your still life, think about, okay, what technique do I want to do first or second? And what makes sense just sequentially in organizing your still life. Okay, the next technique is painting with a liner. And a liner is a type of brush, but you can also make your own. Lining brushes always have a lot of long, tapered bristles. And the thing behind a liner brush is it creates lines that seem to go on forever and ever and ever. So this is wonderful for creating a pattern. If I just use a regular brush, it's not going to hold this much paint. And this is actually a brush that I cut. It was an old brush that was damaged, and so I actually trimmed it to create this nice long pointed tip. But you can buy liner brushes, and some of them are called script liners, and they might be this long. Or there's sign painters might have bristles that are this long instead of this long. So they last a long time. They're made especially for lettering, but I love them for the type of lines you can get. You can get skinny lines, thick lines, depending on the point of your brush. So this might be good in your still life if you're doing flowers, if you're doing stems, if you're just creating a pattern of lines, a yarn ball, whatever, because you can keep going. And of course, you can dip into more than one color. I can dip into 2 different colors. Oh, that didn't show the other color that much. These colors are a little similar. But often you can get colors that it shows more than one color on your brush. I can pick up the brush. I can make skinny tips, ends with this brush. This is really fun for doing free form designs with lots of shape, movement. This, of course, is great also for outlining. So you can do really skinny, fine lines, or you can do a line that's fatter like this. You can use bigger brushes and trim them down. Okay, so that is painting with a liner, or they're often called script liners. The next technique is similar, but instead of a brush, we're using twigs. Doesn't cost anything. Go out and find some twigs. And I like to find some of these that have lots of different ends to them because it's going to create a different effect. This is going to be more scraggly. This would be hard to get this effect using a regular brush because this is a more ragged edge. I can get thick edges, thick shapes. I can get thin edges, thin shapes. So depending on the twig, you can get just so many different effects. I love these because it also will loosen you up. You could do this over the whole background of a painting for a background effect. You can do it dry, or we could have the background wet. So as you know, if you start with something that's already wet, it's really going to run a lot. And you might like that effect. So here we're starting with pretty much just water with a little tint in it. And here's my twig. So what's going to happen? You know it's going to run, right? You can still see the line, but it becomes more diffuse and softer. So this is using a twig. So we have done 5 things: hard and soft edges, using salt, stamping, painting with a liner brush, and twig drawing. So those are the 5 techniques you need to use with your still life. So as always, find some objects that you like, or one object. I'm going to have you take a photo of it and print it off. So we have hundreds of things that can be used for still lifes. You might have some things at home or where you live, or maybe they are heirloom pieces from your family. So you can photograph those first, then we know what you're really going for. Then the second part is actually cutting them out or drawing so you can arrange them on your paper. So that's what you want to do, and you'll do your little thumbnail sketch so I can see that you're going off at least 3 edges. And don't forget, just the background is not counting as an edge going off. It has to be an actual object that goes off the edge. And then practice your techniques. And then also look up the artist, an artist you like, or maybe one you don't like. But what is it that you like about that artist and what don't you like? So maybe you could find an artist who does still life. There's thousands of artists who do still life paintings. And examine, is there something about that artist that you would like to maybe incorporate some of the ideas you've learned by looking at that artist? So this is Julia Noyes, and this is your still life assignment. We'll see you soon.